Every morning, the thermos and sandwich were gone before the first bell. The banana peel was always neatly folded into a napkin and tucked back inside the locker, as if to say, I know this is a gift, and I won't waste it. In their place, little things began to appear. At first, it was a single rubber band, looped carefully around the latch. Then a sticker, a small silver star, half peeled at the corner. A green button. A red apple with one thumbprint in the waxy skin. They were tokens, tiny messages from a child who had no other way to speak. Caroline noticed the offerings with quiet gratitude. She never took them away. She simply let them be, like fragile flowers left on a grave. There was an unspoken rhythm to it. Every day, she left breakfast before sunrise. And every day, something was returned, not just eaten food, but proof of trust. A silent exchange. Ivy never said thank you. She didn't need to. The meaning was there in every carefully chosen object. Caroline never acknowledged the tokens directly. She never looked into the locker longer than a moment, never hovered nearby, never waited for a glimpse of Ivy. That wasn't the point. Kindness, she believed, should be invisible. It wasn't about recognition, it was about relief. About making sure a child didn't sit through math class with an empty stomach, didn't walk home in the dark with hunger twisting her insides. It became their quiet ritual. Locker 108, thermos on the right, sandwich on the left. Always wrapped neatly. Always warm if she could manage it. Caroline adjusted her shift so she could pass by at the right time, before the school's buzz began, when the halls were still full of dust motes and low-humming light. Some mornings, she swore she could feel Ivy's eyes on her, from down the hallway or through the narrow window of a classroom door. Not openly watching, but aware. Recognizing the echo of footsteps, the creak of her mop bucket, the soft thud of her work boots. As if the girl had memorized the sound of someone who meant her no harm. Caroline never tried to make contact. She avoided even glancing toward the sixth-grade classrooms during passing period. There was a code in these kinds of kindnesses, fragile, easily broken by too much attention. It had to remain unspoken to remain intact. But sometimes the silence between them felt almost like a conversation. The way Ivy folded her napkin. The exact center placement of a paperclip. One day, a tiny scrap of notebook paper appeared, folded into a triangle. On it, drawn with pencil, a steaming mug, and beside it, the faint outline of a smile. Caroline folded the paper and tucked it into her wallet. She didn't tell anyone. Not about the food, not about the notes, not about the ache she felt each time she saw Ivy alone in the lunchroom, picking at a government-issued sandwich with robotic hands. The girl never laughed, never raised her hand in class, never lined up for pizza like the other kids on Fridays. She always waited until the cafeteria had cleared, then slid into a seat near the far wall and unzipped her book like it was a shield. It reminded Caroline of herself at 12, the way she used to walk the long way home just to avoid the other kids. The way she would fill her thermos with warm water and pretend it was soup. She knew that kind of hunger. The kind you don't talk about because you're too ashamed, because you think needing is something to be hidden. And Ivy was a master of hiding. One day, Caroline saw her sitting behind the bleachers during gym class, knees drawn up, eyes shut tight. She was supposed to be running laps, like the other girls. But no one had noticed. Or maybe they had, and just didn't care. Caroline moved on without stopping. She wouldn't risk exposing her. But she left a second sandwich in the locker that day, just in case. The exchange continued for weeks. No words. No eye contact. Just food and tokens. Offer and reply. A human conversation made entirely of gestures. But one morning, as Caroline was wiping down the hallway outside the library, she saw Ivy pass by. The girl didn't speak. But for the first time, she paused. Not long. Just half a second. Enough to glance up, meet Caroline's eyes, and then look quickly away. It was nothing. And yet, everything. Caroline stood still for a long moment after. heart beating louder than the floor polisher down the hall. Because sometimes, all it takes is a glance to know that your presence has become a refuge. That night, Caroline lay in bed with the paper mug drawing beside her. She traced its edges with one finger, her mind returning to the hallway, the glance, the pause. In her life, there had been very few moments like that, moments where silence was not absence, but acknowledgement. She thought of Ivy alone in her world, protecting something fragile. And how, without meaning to, she had stepped into that world not as a rescuer, but as someone who simply refused to look away. She had never meant to matter to anyone. Not here. Not like this. But now, she did. On a Monday in early February, the hallway outside locker 108 felt colder than usual. The school's old heating vents clanged to life too late each morning, and a thin line of frost had crept along the base of the lockers. Caroline's fingers were stiff as she turned the combination dial, a practiced twist that now came as second nature, and slid a warm thermos of chamomile tea into the narrow metal shelf. A boiled egg, sliced apple, and a folded napkin joined it. The silence of the hall pressed in, heavy but familiar. But when she returned at lunch to quietly check that the offering had been taken, something she did without fully admitting it to herself, she froze. The food was still there. Untouched. The thermos was exactly where she had placed it, the apple beginning to sweat beneath its plastic wrap. The napkin hadn't moved. A tightness crept into her chest, and her mind began to spin. Was Ivy sick? Did someone find out? That afternoon, she lingered near the lockers longer than she should have. She wiped already clean corners. She checked her supply cart twice. She avoided the gaze of the security camera at the far end of the hall. And when the last bell rang and the building began its slow exhale, she waited. A few minutes. Then a few more. At 3:37 p.m., Ivy appeared, walking slowly. Her steps were cautious, her posture more rigid than usual. And in her hands, crumpled, like it had been clutched too long, was a torn magazine page. Caroline's breath caught when she recognized it, a ripped-out ad for a grocery chain, across which someone had scrawled jagged letters in permanent marker. Feeding charity cases now? Bet you're proud. The words bled into the paper like venom. There was no name, no signature. Just malice. Crude and deliberate. Ivy stared at her locker for a long time. Then, without opening it, she folded the paper in half, placed it gently on the floor, and walked away. Her steps didn't falter, but there was something unnatural in the way she held her shoulders, too square, too still. Caroline stood frozen behind the corner. Rage rose in her throat, but she swallowed it. This wasn't about her anger. It was about Ivy's shame. Someone had seen. Someone had twisted kindness into humiliation. And now the fragile bond they had built, weeks of quiet rituals, of wordless care, had been pierced by cruelty. The next morning, the food was gone again. Not the cruel note. The breakfast. And in its place, a green paperclip bent into the shape of a heart. Caroline took it and tucked it into her lanyard pouch, beside the paper mug drawing. But the damage had been done. That same afternoon, Caroline was called to the principal's office. A summons over the intercom, flat and impersonal. She wiped her hands on her uniform and walked with measured steps, her cart parked neatly in the janitor's closet. In the hallway, a pair of seventh graders whispered behind her. She ignored them. Inside the office, she expected disappointment. A warning. Maybe even termination. She had violated no policy, not technically, but she knew how bureaucracy worked. Feeding a student without documentation, leaving unapproved items in lockers, acting outside her job description. All were grounds for reprimand. But what she didn't expect were the three men seated across from the principal's desk. All in suits. All silent. Principal Hargrove cleared her throat. Ms. Brooks. This is Mr. Terrence Lawson and his colleagues from Lawson Family Foundation. Caroline nodded slowly, unsure of the context. Her hands remained at her sides. Mr. Lawson is Ivy's father. For a long moment, nothing moved. Terrence Lawson stood. His suit was expensive, but worn like armor. His expression was unreadable. In his hand, he held a folded piece of notebook paper, the same kind Ivy used. "She gave me this yesterday," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "It's the first note she's written since my wife died. The first voluntary communication in over a year." He held it up. Caroline couldn't see the words, but she saw his hand tremble. It said, "The lady who leaves me food remembers my mornings. She's the only one who does." Silence fell like snow in the room. Lawson exhaled. "She hasn't spoken to her therapist. Barely to me. But she wrote this. Because of you." Caroline's throat tightened. She looked down, unsure what to say, but knowing no words were expected. She didn't cry. She just nodded. Once. Then the man added, "We'd like to talk to you about a proposal." The rest of the conversation was a blur. Something about funding. About a new initiative. About dignity and nourishment. About a space in the school unused since the art program was defunded, a room with big windows and long tables. And then Caroline heard the words that echoed louder than all the rest. "We'd like you to run it. Whatever you did for Ivy, do it for every child like her." Caroline left the office with no punishment. No reprimand. Just a folder in her hands. And the quiet sense that maybe, just maybe, someone had noticed. Not just the sandwiches. Not just the thermos. But the care. The next day, the cruel note was gone from the floor outside locker 108. In its place, a single military-style challenge coin rested on the tile, its edges smoothed with age, its surface engraved with a date and two initials, ML. Caroline picked it up and closed her hand around it. It was warm from the morning sun. The cafe opened 2 months later under the name 108 Mornings. No one asked where the name came from. Some assumed it was a biblical reference, others thought it was an address. Only Caroline and Ivy knew the truth. Locker 108, the birthplace of quiet kindness, had become more than a place. It was now a symbol of beginning. A number that meant, "You are not alone this morning." The room had once been a forgotten art studio, its windows clouded with dust, its tables chipped from years of neglect. But when the light poured in, it still glowed. The Lawson Foundation funded the renovation quietly, no newspaper articles, no ribbon cuttings. Caroline requested that it remain discreet. The cafe didn't need applause. It needed warmth. There were no registers. No payment counter. Just trays. Muffins, scrambled eggs, apples, oatmeal. A big urn of tea sat in the corner beside a stack of clean mugs. Ivy's drawings were laminated into placemats, cartoons of steaming soup bowls, sandwiches smiling with googly eyes. Children were invited to eat. That was it. No explanations. No requirements. They came hesitantly at first. A few 6th graders, then a shy 7th grader with a too-thin jacket. Word spread. Within 3 weeks, over 30 students stopped by every morning. Some came just for the food. Some came to sit in the light and breathe. Ivy started helping after school. She was still silent most of the time, but her hands were steady. She lined up trays, wiped down tables, folded napkins into cranes. One afternoon, she whispered to Caroline, "I want to learn how to make the tea." It was the first full sentence she'd spoken aloud in months. Caroline nodded without a word and showed her how to steep the leaves just right. The teachers noticed the change. Students who once fell asleep in first period were now alert. Disciplinary notes dropped. One guidance counselor wrote that the cafe was doing something the school couldn't. It was feeding more than hunger. As weeks turned into months, the kindness grew roots. Parents began leaving small donations in a sealed box by the door, no names attached. A retired librarian offered to come read stories to early arrivers. A high school student made a website to help collect winter coats. Ivy began speaking more often, not loudly, but clearly. Her voice, when it came, was soft and certain, like water finding its way through stone. And Caroline? She never picked up the mop again. Her name wasn't on the school directory. No plaque hung in her honor. But every morning, she stood behind the counter in her clean apron, placing boiled eggs and muffins on trays like she had done quietly for one child. Only now, there were many. She never mentioned the coin. It sat on a shelf in her apartment beside the paper drawing of the mug and the green heart-shaped paperclip. She didn't know what the initials ML meant. Maybe it was Ivy's mother. Maybe it was someone else who had known hunger. It didn't matter. It was just another quiet thank you from a world that rarely said thank you. On a spring morning, nearly a year after that first sandwich, the school hosted its annual assembly. The auditorium was packed. The principal gave a long speech about test scores and future goals. Students clapped politely. Then, as the lights dimmed, a name was called that no one expected. Miss Caroline Brooks. She rose slowly from her seat in the back. A spotlight found her as she stepped onto the stage. She was still wearing her apron. The same one she wore every morning. Behind her, a group of students lined up with Ivy at the front. They each held a tray with a breakfast item on it. Ivy's held a thermos. They stood in silence, offering no words, only symbols. A reenactment of all the quiet mornings that had passed between them. Then Ivy stepped forward and handed her a framed plaque. On it, carved in simple script. For remembering us when no one else did. The room held its breath. There was no music, no applause. Just stillness. A few teachers wiped their eyes. The principal lowered her gaze. Caroline looked out across the rows of students. She saw children who had once sat alone, now whispering to each other. Kids who had once hidden their hunger, now smiling over laminated placemats. Ivy reached for her hand, and this time, Caroline took it. There was nothing grand about the moment. It wasn't meant to be. It was a thank you, the kind that matters. The kind that comes not from admiration, but from recognition. Outside, spring birds sang from the gutters. The frost was gone. The hallway near locker 108 had been repainted, but Caroline still passed it each day on her way to the cafe. Sometimes she paused. Not long. Just enough to remember. Because what began as a simple breakfast had become something larger than food. Larger than shame or silence or even kindness. It had become the proof that dignity, even when offered in secret, can outlast cruelty. She didn't need to be noticed. She only needed to matter. And she did.